The film begins in the late 1800s and introduces us to Ephraim Winslow, a former timberman searching for work and a chance at a fresh start. He arrives on a remote island off the Scottish coast just as the previous wikis are departing. Winslow has accepted a 4-week assignment assisting the island's lighthouse keeper, Thomas Wake, a 65-year-old sailor with a gruff personality, strange habits, and an unsettling presence. On his very first day, Winslow settles into his cramped sleeping quarters and discovers a hole in his mattress. Curious, he investigates and finds a small wooden carving of a mermaid hidden inside, which he quietly slips into his pocket. That evening, Winslow shares dinner with Wake and quickly realizes that his new companion is an eccentric and deeply peculiar man. During their meal, Wake insists on making a toast with alcohol. Winslow refuses, explaining that he no longer drinks, but Wake considers refusing a toast to be terrible luck. Reluctantly, Winslow participates by toasting with water instead. Later that night, Wake climbs to the lantern room at the top of the lighthouse. There, he strips naked and sits before the powerful beam of light, staring into it with an almost religious fascination, as though completely entranced by its presence. Meanwhile, Winslow notices the lighthouse beam illuminating the shoreline and walks toward the sea. There, he appears to witness a mermaid swimming beneath the water's surface. Suddenly, he awakens, realizing it was only a dream. As the days pass, Winslow is assigned the harshest and most exhausting labor imaginable. He spends his time stirring oil reservoirs, hauling heavy fuel containers, cleaning chamber pots, and performing endless maintenance work. Throughout his duties, he is repeatedly harassed by an aggressive seagull that seems unusually fixated on him. One day, while carrying oil to the lighthouse, Winslow attempts to enter the lantern room, only for Wake to stop him immediately. Wake firmly reminds him that nobody except the head keeper is permitted inside. Although the incident sparks Winslow's curiosity, he initially lets the matter go. During dinner that evening, he mentions the troublesome seagull, prompting Wake to share a disturbing superstition. According to sailors' lore, seagulls contain the souls of dead seamen and should never be harmed. Winslow dismisses the story as nonsense, causing Wake to strike him across the head. After a tense confrontation, Wake quickly apologizes and changes the subject. That night, Winslow finds the same seagull staring at him through his window, robbing him of sleep. The following morning, after dragging a heavy wheelbarrow of coal up the hill, he is once again berated by Wake for supposedly cleaning improperly. Despite already repeating the task multiple times, Winslow is ordered to do it all over again. He protests, arguing that he came there to work, not to be treated like a slave. Wake responds by declaring that Winslow's only responsibility is obedience, regardless of how unreasonable the order may be. He even threatens to dock his wages. Soon afterward, Wake forces Winslow to paint the exterior of the lighthouse while hanging from a rope high above the ground. The rope eventually snaps, sending Winslow crashing downward. When he regains consciousness, he discovers a seagull pecking at his clothing. Later that night, Wake asks Winslow about his past. Winslow explains that he previously worked as a timberman and accepted this job because of the substantial pay. He hopes to earn enough money to buy a house and begin a new life. In return, Wake reveals that he has spent most of his existence at sea, which ultimately destroyed his marriage. The following day, Winslow hears strange noises coming from the lantern room and briefly catches sight of what appears to be an octopus tentacle. Later, he discovers a dead seagull floating in the well. When another seagull suddenly attacks him, Winslow snaps and brutally beats it to death. That evening, he and Wake drink heavily together. They sing sea shanties, argue, laugh, and dance around the room. The next morning, Winslow wanders to the shore and encounters a beautiful mermaid lying on the rocks. But when the creature suddenly awakens and emits a horrifying scream, Winslow panics and runs back to the lighthouse. Eventually, the 4 weeks come to an end. However, violent storms prevent the arrival of the supply boat that was supposed to take them home. Their food supplies quickly spoil, leaving only an emergency cache buried near the lighthouse. When they dig it up, they discover that the reserve contains no food at all, only alcohol. Realizing they may be stranded for months, the two men resign themselves to their fate and begin drinking heavily while waiting for rescue. Although they increasingly despise one another, their isolation forces them into each other's company. Wake predicts that the storm will delay any rescue efforts for a very long time. As the days blur together, their relationship becomes increasingly toxic. They drink together, fight constantly, and then return to drinking once again. One night, after becoming heavily intoxicated, Winslow mocks Wake and ridicules him by calling him nothing more than a cook. Enraged, Wake launches into a terrifying monologue, invoking Neptune himself and cursing Winslow to drown. As the storm continues without end, Winslow's mental condition steadily deteriorates. One night, he follows Wake to the lighthouse summit and sits beneath the lantern room, obsessing over the mystery hidden inside. Unable to unlock the door, he later sneaks into Wake's quarters and attempts to steal the key while Wake sleeps. However, Wake awakens unexpectedly and simply orders him back to work, unaware of his intentions. Winslow's behavior becomes increasingly erratic. He begins using the wooden mermaid carving to satisfy his growing obsession. Later, while checking a lobster trap, he discovers the severed head of a one-eyed man inside. That night, he and Wake once again become heavily intoxicated. They dance together in a strangely intimate moment before suddenly turning violent and knocking each other unconscious. Eventually, Winslow finally reveals the truth. His real name is not Ephraim Winslow at all. He confesses that his true identity is Thomas Howard and admits that he allowed the real Ephraim Winslow to die before stealing his identity and using it throughout his life. That night, Thomas experiences another horrifying vision. Standing atop the lighthouse, he suddenly sees Wake appear behind him with glowing eyes. Terrified, Thomas attempts to flee the island using a lifeboat. However, Wake catches him and destroys the boat with an axe, refusing to let him escape. Thomas runs back toward the lighthouse while Wake pursues him. Cornered, Thomas accuses Wake of murdering the previous Wiki after discovering the severed head. Wake dismisses the accusations as madness and instead threatens to expose Thomas's true identity. He then manipulates Thomas into believing that Thomas himself destroyed the boat. Confused and emotionally shattered, Thomas retreats into silence. By now, they have exhausted their alcohol supply and resort to drinking a mixture of honey and lamp oil. Meanwhile, the storm grows even more violent, flooding the lighthouse and destroying much of the interior. One night, Thomas discovers Wake's work ledger and reads through its contents. To his horror, he finds that Wake has written numerous complaints and criticisms about his performance. Furious, Thomas confronts him and accuses him of being a filthy, miserable liar. Wake responds by officially relieving Thomas of his duties. Thomas tears pages from the ledger and breaks down emotionally. Falling to his knees, he admits that despite everything, he has learned from Wake and begs him to finally allow him access to the lantern room. Wake refuses. This rejection pushes Thomas over the edge. He insults Wake, blaming his personality for the collapse of his family. Wake retaliates by accusing Thomas of murder and questioning whether he plans to kill again. Thomas explodes into violence. As he attacks Wake, reality itself begins to unravel. Wake transforms into the real Ephraim Winslow. Then Ephraim becomes the mermaid that has haunted Thomas's visions. The mermaid wraps her tentacles around his throat before transforming once more into a monstrous sea creature resembling Wake himself. But Thomas continues beating him. Eventually, the hallucinations fade, and Wake returns to normal. In a horrifying act of humiliation, Thomas forces Wake to bark like a dog, places a leash around his neck, and drags him outside. There, he buries Wake alive beneath the dirt. Determined to uncover the lighthouse's final secret, Thomas takes the key from Wake's hand and rushes back inside. However, Wake manages to escape and attacks Thomas with an axe, striking him in the shoulder. This final act drives Thomas completely insane. He overpowers Wake and kills him by smashing a sharp object into his head. Then, with manic determination, Thomas climbs to the very top of the lighthouse and unlocks the lantern room at last. For the first time, he gazes directly into the mysterious light. Whatever he sees completely shatters his mind. Laughing and screaming in uncontrollable hysteria, Thomas loses his footing, falls backward, and tumbles violently down the spiral staircase. The film ends with one final, haunting image. Thomas lies naked and broken upon the rocky shore as seagulls descend upon him and begin feeding on his exposed intestines.